The phone rang while I was under the hood of a Subaru, grease smeared across my hands, my muscles tense from holding the wrench at an awkward angle. The vibration was muted against the metal, but I knew it was my mother. I wiped my hands on a rag, took a deep breath, and answered. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" My voice was steady, almost casual, though I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "Harper, listen. About Thanksgiving this year." Her tone was clipped, precise, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed in front of the mirror. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to anticipate the words, but my life had trained me for disappointment. "Yeah, we're keeping it small," she continued. I nodded to myself even though she couldn't see me. The next sentence hit harder than I expected. "Camila is bringing her boyfriend home for the first time. It's a big deal. He works in finance, a very respectable job, and she wants everything to be perfect. She doesn't want you there." For a second I thought I misheard. My hands went slack around the wrench, the smell of oil suddenly thick in the air. "What?" I whispered. "Don't make this difficult, Harper. You know how Camilla is about image, about how things look. She's nervous. It's important to her that nothing makes him uncomfortable, and you would make him uncomfortable. Your job, all the grease, the uniforms, the hands. Look, honey, a manual labor job isn't something everyone understands. He might not get it. Camilla said it could make things awkward." I swallowed. The wrench felt heavy in my hands, the metal biting into my palms. A manual labor job? That was my life, my pride, the thing that gave me clarity when my family had never noticed me. I breathed slowly, measured. "I understand," I said finally. No tremor, no cracking voice, just flat calm that belied the sharp ache in my chest. "Good. I knew you would. You've always been reasonable," Mom replied. Reasonable? Useful? Convenient. The word stung, a familiar pattern I had lived with my entire life. I hung up, staring at the dim glow of the garage lights reflecting off the hood of the Subaru. For a long time, I didn't move. The world felt muted, as if someone had pressed cotton against my ears. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't sad either. I was suspended in that strange, silent place where hurt becomes too big to name. But underneath the numbness, something began to stir. A memory, old and familiar, stacked like boxes in an attic I never meant to open. Growing up in Fort Collins, our house sat third on Cottonwood Lane, peeling blue paint, hedges trimmed meticulously because Mom insisted, the faint smell of lawn fertilizer in the spring. Camilla, my younger sister, always shone. Even as a child she glowed, her brown eyes huge, her dimples perfect, her hair glossy and untangled. At school she collected medals, trophies, and ribbons like she collected compliments. At home she walked in with a medal in hand, and Dad would beam, clapping her on the back. "Our overachiever," he'd say, and then glance at me with a nod that said, "Harper, grab the toolbox. The back door is stuck again." I was 9 when the chain on my bike snapped. Dad scratched his head, muttered about inconvenience, and I crouched, studying the broken link like it was a puzzle. 15 minutes later, the chain was fixed. Dad blinked and said, "Huh, at least you're good for something." Pride or embarrassment? I never knew which. I learned early that being useful didn't make you loved. At 12, I knelt on the cold bathroom floor, hands red from frozen water, fixing a leaky faucet. Mom didn't hug me, didn't thank me. She called down the hallway, "See, Harper's so helpful. I don't know what we'd do without her." Like I was a tool, not a daughter. By the time I was 16, I was the one who drove across town at midnight to buff Camilla's car after she scraped the bumper. I paid overdue registration fees. I covered insurance payments Dad forgot. Every Thanksgiving morning, I checked tire pressures on 3 cars, patched drywall, replaced burnt-out lights, all while Mom basted the turkey. Harper's the strongest. She'll manage. Strong, useful, convenient. words that built invisible walls between me and the affection I craved. That night, after the call, I sat in my truck, the cold Colorado wind pressing against the windows, and replayed Mom's clipped voice. My entire life had been a catalog of conditional approval: perform, fix, manage, and in return, receive acknowledgement, not love. Engines, machines, metal, they didn't lie. They didn't ask for apologies or explanations. They rewarded precision, patience, effort. In the garage, I learned something vital. I could exist without their approval. I could be someone. Harper Lane was someone, even if no one at Cottonwood Lane ever bothered to see it. I thought of Mr. Owens, shoveling snow alone in the pre-dawn winter. I thought of Marissa, the single mom crying on my driveway last Thanksgiving when her car battery died. I thought of the teens at the youth shelter I taught basic car maintenance to on Saturdays. People who deserved warmth, attention, and recognition, not crumbs from conditional affection. And I realized for the first time that being excluded from Thanksgiving wasn't the punishment I thought it was. It was liberation. A quiet, unexpected, and startling freedom. My family believed they were protecting Camilla's image, her shiny, curated life. They had no idea they were finally freeing me from the invisible chains I had carried since childhood. I locked up the garage that night, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to my jacket. The numbness lingered, wrapping around my ribs, but beneath it, something raw and honest began to stir. Possibility. Thanksgiving was coming, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an invitation. I wasn't waiting to be included. For the first time, I could build something of my own, something real, something untainted by family expectations. And in that realization, I finally felt steady, quiet, and free. I still remember the sound of my mother's heels clicking against the linoleum kitchen floor, a rhythmic punctuation to our lives. She moved through the house with precision, each step measured, each glance calculated. In her eyes, Camilla always radiated light. The daughter who was polished, effortless, a living advertisement for success. And there I was, Harper Lane, quiet, sticky-handed, underfoot, the one who fixed things nobody else wanted to touch. It started when I was small. I was 9 years old when the chain on my bike snapped. Dad had his hands in his pockets, muttering about inconvenience, and Mom hovered near the doorway, shaking her head as if mere observation could solve the problem. I knelt on the driveway, fingers fumbling with the metal links, sweat and grease coating my palms. I didn't know if I was proud or embarrassed when 15 minutes later, the chain clicked back into place. Dad glanced down, his expression neutral, then said, "Huh, at least you're good for something." That sentence followed me like a shadow for years, a reminder that usefulness was a currency, love a separate, almost unreachable concept. By the time I was 12, I had learned to manage leaky faucets, clogged sinks, and stubborn door hinges. I remember one winter afternoon kneeling on the bathroom floor, red hands wrapped around a wrench, listening to the gentle drip of water finally cease. Mom didn't notice. She didn't hug me, didn't say thank you. She simply called from the hallway, "See, Harper's so helpful, I don't know what we'd do without her." Helpful, not loved, not seen. Helpful. That was the word that defined me in their eyes, the badge I was forced to wear. Camilla, my younger sister by 3 years, floated through life like light itself. Her accomplishments were heralded, displayed, celebrated. Every trophy, every medal, every perfect performance in speech contests or science fairs was carefully placed on the mantel, meticulously catalogued like artifacts in a museum. Dad's eyes would shine with pride as he clapped her on the back, while I silently carried the weight of invisible labor. The repairs, the forgotten errands, the emergencies no one else wanted to touch, they fell on me without acknowledgement, without gratitude, and I learned to accept it. To be useful was my role. Love was something I glimpsed only in crumbs. I remember the time Camilla scraped the bumper of her brand new car. It was just a scratch, barely noticeable, but in her eyes, it was a catastrophe. Midnight, cold and dark, I drove across town, buffing out the scrape while she fretted over a morning event. She didn't thank me in any meaningful way, she simply floated back to her world, polished and perfect. And my parents? They nodded, satisfied, as if my efforts were a given. Harper's the strongest. She'll manage. That was their mantra. Strong, useful, convenient. And each word, each repetition, chipped away at the part of me that wanted to belong. Birthdays, holidays, family photos. Camila always took the front row. She smiled for the cameras, her curls perfectly placed, her teeth gleaming, her skin glowing. I stood in the background, sometimes holding a toolbox, sometimes wiping my hands on a rag, always necessary, never acknowledged. I learned the art of invisibility early. Be seen only when required, speak only when spoken to, and always, always do the work that no one else wanted to do. By the time I was 15, I was a quiet expert at managing emergencies. The refrigerator dies? Call me. The lawnmower jammed? Harper. Electrical outlet spark? Harper. Cable box broken? Harper. I became the household technician, the quiet problem solver. No accolades, no attention, just a steady stream of tasks that needed doing. And I did them because I had no other choice. Because if I didn't, no one else would. And I had learned that in their eyes, my worth was measured by the number of tasks completed, not the heart behind them. School offered a brief reprieve, but even there, I was measured against my sister. Teachers praised Camilla for her charisma, her speech, her polished presentations. I got solid grades, nothing spectacular, nothing worthy of the spotlight. College? My parents never encouraged me, not because I couldn't excel, but because I wasn't the one they envisioned as a shining example. Camilla needed the support more. Mom phrased it as protection, steering me toward a practical life, toward trades and skills, toward something sensible. But I knew the truth. I was always the quiet backup, the safety net, the one who could be counted on but not admired. The garage became my refuge. I spent hours there, hands coated in grease, working on engines, brakes, and carburetors. The machines didn't judge. They didn't compare me to Camilla. They didn't demand charisma or photogenic perfection. Metal responded to effort, timing, and skill. Bolts tightened, engines roared to life, and every fix was a small victory that belonged entirely to me. For the first time, I felt competence without expectation, accomplishment without comparison. Yet even in the garage, the patterns of my family lingered. Every repair I did for them outside the garage was a reminder that my value was tied to usefulness. I fixed Camilla's car before every big date, every presentation, every event where she had to look perfect. I covered late bills, managed insurance payments, and ensured everything ran smoothly while my parents praised her every achievement and barely noticed mine. The dichotomy was stark. Camilla admired, Harper useful. And I carried that truth with quiet acceptance, suppressing the ache it left in my chest. The year before the Thanksgiving phone call, I had been steadily climbing in my trade. I could diagnose an engine problem, repair a transmission, and rebuild brake systems with skill and precision. The garage was my cathedral, the torque wrench my instrument of prayer. I found a rhythm in the work that eluded me in family life, a life where love was conditional and praise selective. There, amidst the smell of gasoline and the hum of machinery, I discovered the truth about myself. I could be someone outside of their gaze, someone steady, competent, and whole. But the call from Mom shattered that fragile equilibrium. I realized that exclusion wasn't new. Being overlooked was a lifetime pattern. What was new was that it hurt in a different way. I was no longer a child absorbing lessons. I was an adult recognizing patterns. The phone call didn't just reopen old wounds, it highlighted a choice I had never seen before. I could continue to accept conditional love, invisibility, and usefulness as worth, or I could start carving a life that belonged entirely to me. I sat in the quiet of the garage that night, my hands still smelling faintly of oil, and let the numbness settle. For once, the ache wasn't about failure. It was about clarity. I understood, with a sharp, terrifying precision, that I didn't have to belong to a family that measured me by convenience. That realization didn't make the hurt disappear. It didn't make the memories vanish. But it gave me a kind of power I hadn't felt in years. The knowledge that my life, my work, and my worth were mine to define. And as the shadows stretched across the garage floor, I made a silent vow. One day, I would build a table where people were valued for who they were, not what they could do. Where love wasn't conditional, where warmth and kindness were the only requirements to belong. That night, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of oil, I began to see a path forward. One that didn't include being merely useful, merely tolerated. One that included being seen, recognized, and, finally, loved. The childhood of usefulness had shaped me, yes, but it had also prepared me. Every bolt I tightened, every car I repaired, every small act of service had built strength in my hands, precision in my mind, and clarity in my heart. I was Harper Lane, quiet, steady, and capable. And for the first time, I didn't need their validation to know it. The garage door groaned as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of motor oil and cold metal wrapping around me like an old, comforting coat. Morning sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long golden rectangles across the cracked concrete floor. This was my domain, Redwood Garage, where I felt seen, competent, and alive. Unlike the rooms of my childhood home, where accomplishments were invisible unless they served someone else, here, my efforts mattered simply because they worked. I ran my hands along the hood of a sedan I'd been working on the past few days. The engine hummed softly under my fingertips, a living thing that responded to touch, attention, and patience. Every bolt, every timing belt, every brake pad spoke a truth that humans often refuse to acknowledge. That work, done with care and precision, was worth something, regardless of accolades. And for the first time in years, I felt that truth belonged entirely to me. It hadn't always been this way. Adult life had its own version of my childhood, a world where competence was often invisible, where polite society valued charisma over consistency, networking over actual skill. But in this sanctuary, surrounded by tools and machines, I had discovered something profound. Machines didn't lie. They didn't play favorites. They didn't care if my hair was photogenic or if my posture was perfect. They only cared about precision, timing, and attention to detail. And in return, they offered a kind of honesty I had never received from family, teachers, or peers. I knelt on the floor, wrench in hand, adjusting a carburetor with a careful turn. The click of the bolt locking into place echoed in the stillness. That click had become a prayer, a meditation, a reassurance that something in my life, at least, was working. My thoughts drifted to the phone call from my mother a week ago. The sting of exclusion had been sharp, but the numbness that followed had allowed clarity to settle in. I realized that being left out of Thanksgiving, being uninvited because of grease-stained hands and calloused knuckles, wasn't punishment. It was liberation. Liberation had a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm, like the gentle purr of an engine coming to life after a long repair. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It simply existed, humming beneath the surface of all the resentment, hurt, and invisible labor that had defined my life. And in that hum, I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to see as a child, that my worth was not measured by how I could serve others, but by the integrity with which I lived, worked, and treated the world. Harper Lane, 29 years old, a full-time auto mechanic in Boulder, Colorado, and the kind of woman people often overlooked at first glance. Quiet, steady, reliable. The world had always been louder than me, flashier than me, more demanding, more judgmental. But here, under car lifts and fluorescent lights, I had found a space that matched me. I learned to read engines the way other people read faces, with patience, attention, and empathy. A misfiring cylinder, a worn brake pad, a loose wire, they all told stories if you listened carefully. And I listened, always. I worked on a customer's old pickup that morning, the hood open and a rag tucked into my back pocket. Every twist of the wrench, every careful adjustment, reminded me of all the years I had spent fixing the world for people who never saw me. I thought of Camilla, gliding through life like a spotlight followed her every move. She had accolades, admiration, a curated perfection that drew attention effortlessly. And me? I had the quiet mastery of skills, the satisfaction of a job completed well, the steady pulse of capability that no one ever applauded. Sometimes I thought about my parents. Not often, but occasionally. The memory of their eyes, the nod of acknowledgement when I repaired something they couldn't be bothered to fix, would flare up. Not pride, not admiration, just recognition of usefulness. Harper's the strongest. She'll manage. They had never understood that strength is not the same as happiness, that usefulness is not a substitute for love. I had spent years learning to accept it. And then finally, I had stopped waiting for them to see me. The garage wasn't just a place for engines and transmissions. It was a sanctuary where I built competence, confidence, and clarity. Every vehicle I worked on became a lesson in persistence. Every repair a reminder that skill and patience could overcome neglect and disappointment. And slowly, over countless mornings and evenings, I began to build something more profound than mechanical mastery. I was constructing a life that belonged to me. Memories drifted in and out as I worked. Marissa, a single mother, had broken down outside my garage last Thanksgiving. I had fixed her car battery without charge, her daughter watching with wide eyes, tears staining her scarf as she thanked me over and over. Mr. Owens, the retired postman, shoveling snow alone, his children absent across the country. The teens at the youth shelter, struggling with hardship I had once thought I could never escape. All these lives, quiet and unnoticed, had become part of the rhythm of my own. I realized then that the world was full of people overlooked, ignored, and unvalued. And if I could offer even a small measure of steadiness, care, or warmth, it was worth more than the hollow praise my family had reserved only for Camila. I tightened the final bolt on the pickup, wiped my hands on a rag and stepped back. The engine purred, the air smelled faintly of oil and rubber, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. I had done what needed to be done. And in doing so, I had reminded myself that my life, my choices, and my work were mine alone. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need a family that measured love by convenience. Yet even in this quiet triumph, I knew the world outside the garage would test me. There would always be people who valued appearances over substance, words over action, image over integrity. But I was no longer the child who craved acknowledgement for merely being present. I was Harper Lane, the one who fixed things quietly, deliberately, and with care. And in that deliberate care, I had discovered something my family could never give me: belonging within myself. By noon, I had finished the repairs. For the morning, the sun now high and bright, illuminating every speck of dust and metal shavings across the garage floor. I leaned against the hood of the pickup, my hands smeared with oil and grime, and felt something rare and unexpected: peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a steady, quiet peace that comes from knowing that you are enough. Not because someone else says so, not because you are convenient, useful, or strong, but because you have chosen to define yourself on your own terms. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the small thermos I kept by the workbench, letting the bitter warmth seep into my hands. Outside, Life moved at its usual frantic pace. People walked by, cars honked, the world demanded speed, attention, and spectacle. And inside, I sat in quiet resistance, letting the hum of engines, the click of bolts, and the smell of motor oil remind me of the only truths that mattered: effort, skill, integrity, and self-respect. The call from Mom, the words of exclusion, the endless comparisons to Camila, none of it mattered here. I had found my truth, and for the first time, I realized that Thanksgiving, family approval, or societal expectations couldn't take it away. Harper Lane had become something I had always longed to be: steady, capable, and free. And as the engines cooled and the sun shifted across the floor, I allowed myself to imagine a different kind of Thanksgiving, one that didn't depend on family or tradition, but on choice, warmth, and authenticity. The garage had shown me that the week leading up to Thanksgiving felt heavier than any week I had experienced as a child. Not because of work, engines, or the cold Colorado wind cutting through my jacket, but because of the quiet gravity of realization. I was no longer a girl waiting for permission, for acknowledgement, for love measured by convenience. I was a woman standing at the edge of something I had always been denied: choice. Mom's voice still echoed in my head, clipped and formal, as if reading a statement. Your job, all the grease, the uniforms, the hands. Your sister doesn't want you there. It's important that her boyfriend feels comfortable. The words had stung at first, a familiar brand of exclusion sharpened by adulthood. But now, several days later, the sting had softened into clarity. I understood something profound for the first time. Being left out by people who only wanted me when it suited them was not a loss. It was a gift. The garage door creaked open that morning, and the familiar smell of oil, metal, and gasoline welcomed me like an old friend. Engines didn't judge, machines didn't compare, metal didn't care if my hair was photogenic or if I smiled on command. Metal and engines responded only to skill, patience, and care. And for the first time, I understood that I had been living among people who measured me by everything metal and machinery never demanded: image, social polish, convenience. I leaned over the hood of a 2012 Honda Civic, my hands deep in the engine bay, tightening the alternator belt with careful precision. Each click of the wrench against metal felt like a pulse of liberation. I thought of Camilla, floating through life in effortless perfection, expecting admiration and acceptance as her birthright. I thought of Mom, calibrating every word to preserve Camila's image, protect the fragile bubble of her curated perfection. And I felt nothing, not resentment, not exactly, not sadness, only a quiet, steady power. Harper Lane, 29 years old, a full-time mechanic, quiet in the beginning, steady when observed closely, independent, capable, free. This version of me had been waiting, quietly, for a lifetime to emerge. It had been forged in oil-streaked hands, in hours spent fixing things others refused to notice, in silent service to a family that would never see me as more than useful. And now, that version of me had permission, not from anyone else, but from myself, to exist fully. I shut the hood of the Civic and wiped my hands on a rag, letting my gaze drift to the garage walls lined with tools, oil stains, and schematics taped unevenly across the surfaces. This place, humble and flawed, was mine. It didn't care for appearances, for social polish, or for approval. Here, effort was enough, skill was enough, integrity was enough. And I realized that, in life outside these walls, I could replicate this sanctuary, create spaces and relationships where authenticity mattered more than convenience. The numbness I had felt after Mom's call had softened into an unexpected warmth, like the fading ache of a bruise that had begun to heal. I let myself sit with it, sipping a mug of cold coffee, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor. For the first time in decades, I was not waiting for an invitation, not hoping for acceptance, not anxious about my worth. I was free to define my own life, my own values, my own family. I thought of the people whose lives had intersected with mine outside my family, the ones overlooked by the world, the ones treated as invisible. Mr. Owens, shoveling snow alone in the frigid dawn. Marissa, a single mother overwhelmed and crying outside my garage the previous Thanksgiving, relieved only by my willingness to help. The teenagers at the youth shelter who had trusted me with knowledge and skill, eyes wide with hope. They were waiting for nothing from me beyond kindness, steadiness, and honesty. And in giving it, I discovered joy, connection, and a sense of belonging I had never received at home. I stood in the middle of the garage, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead, and made a decision. This Thanksgiving, I would not sit in a house where I was measured by what I could do for others rather than who I was. I would not subject myself to conditional love. I would build my own table, not with silverware and candles, but with people who mattered, who deserved warmth, recognition, and inclusion. I would create my own family, not of blood or convenience, but of choice. The idea came slowly, almost tentatively, then grew into a quiet certainty. I could invite those who were overlooked, forgotten, or alone. The ones who had been ignored or minimized, the ones who had been left out of tables, dinners, and celebrations, not because of who they were, but because of who they weren't in someone else's eyes. These were my people, and I could provide the space they needed, a space of warmth, honesty, and care. I thought of my neighbors first. Mr. Owens, whose children hadn't visited in years. He would smile if invited, probably protest at first, then quietly allow himself to enjoy human company he had long forgotten. Marissa and her daughter, who had experienced gratitude and relief in my hands once before, could sit at the table and feel remembered, valued. The teens from the shelter, hungry for guidance, connection, and normalcy, could have a place too. And perhaps, in this circle of chosen family, I could finally taste the love I had been denied for decades. I went home that evening, my jacket stiff with oil, my fingers sticky with grime, and allowed myself to imagine the scene. The table would be modest, mismatched chairs and plates, laughter and conversation, unfiltered by social polish or pretension. People would share stories, eat until they were full, and know, for the first time that day, that they mattered, that they were seen, that they were loved. And in imagining it, I realized that this was a gift I could give not only to them, but to myself. My parents might have thought they were protecting Camilla's image, shielding her boyfriend from discomfort, maintaining appearances. But in reality, they had handed me the rarest kind of gift: permission to leave behind a family that had never loved me unconditionally and to embrace a life built on my own terms. The exclusion that had once stung like a blade now felt like wings unfolding, a liberation that surprised me with its depth. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain myself, apologize for who I was, or earn love through usefulness. I could simply be. And that simple act of existing on my own terms, honest, steady, capable, was more powerful than any approval I had ever sought from my family. As night fell and the garage emptied of vehicles, I sat alone at the workbench, sipping coffee, and letting the quiet settle over me. The ache of past neglect still lingered, a faint pulse reminding me of all I had endured. But it was no longer a chain. It was a marker of survival, resilience, and readiness. I had been shaped by my childhood, forged by years of conditional love and quiet invisibility, and emerged not broken, but prepared. This Thanksgiving, I would not attend a table that never truly welcomed me. I would not wait for love I would never receive on their terms. I would build my own table, my own family, my own definition of belonging. And in that choice, I found not only liberation, but a quiet, steady joy that was entirely mine. For the first time, I realized that exclusion had not taken something from me. It had given me the most precious gift I had ever received: freedom. Freedom to define my life, freedom to build meaningful connections, freedom to live with authenticity, and freedom to finally, fully, choose myself. And for the first time, in years, I felt the hum of possibility beneath my ribs, steady, warm, and unstoppable. The morning of Thanksgiving, the Colorado sky was pale and crisp, the sunlight brushing the frost along the edges of the driveway. For the first time in decades, I didn't wake with a knot in my stomach or the familiar ache of expectation and exclusion. I woke with purpose, with anticipation, with a quiet, steady excitement I had never allowed myself in my family home. The garage smelled faintly of oil and metal, comforting in its permanence. I cleaned off my hands, set down the mug of coffee I had been sipping since dawn, and began preparing for the day, not a day dictated by someone else's schedule, image, or priorities, but a day of my own making. The table, modest and mismatched, was being set in my small apartment. Plates were stacked carefully, silverware placed with quiet precision, napkins folded in uneven triangles, and candles lit to cast soft golden light across the room. The table would not be perfect. It would be honest. It would be real. And that was exactly the point. I thought of each person I had invited. Mr. Owens, with his stoic pride and quiet loneliness, would probably protest at first, telling me he didn't need a fuss. But I knew him. He would settle into the chair, drink his coffee, and allow himself finally to be seen. Marissa and her daughter would arrive, her gratitude tangible, her relief visible in the relaxed posture she had rarely allowed herself. And the teens from the youth shelter, hesitant at first, would find warmth in a place that demanded nothing from them beyond presence and honesty. These people were my chosen family. They were my reminder that the love I had sought, the belonging I had craved, could exist without the hollow approval of my birth family. I prepared food with the same care I had always given to engines, appliances, and household repairs. Nothing extravagant, nothing curated to impress, but everything made with intention. A roast seasoned simply, vegetables roasted until golden, bread baked to a gentle crust, dessert sweet without excess. Each dish was a small act of creation, a tangible reminder that I could nurture and care for others on my own terms. As the doorbell rang, my heart fluttered, not with fear or anxiety, but with warmth. One by one, people entered, eyes wide, faces relaxing as they settled into a space free from judgment and expectation. The chatter began slowly, hesitant smiles exchanged, hands brushing over cups and plates. And then, as the room filled, the energy shifted. Laughter arrived, genuine and unforced. Stories were told, some loud, some whispered, and the weight of loneliness, neglect, and exclusion began to dissipate. I caught myself watching them, the way a mechanic might observe an engine finally running smoothly. Each person was whole, visible, appreciated. Not for appearances, not for achievements, not for usefulness, but simply for being present, simply for being human. And in watching, I realized something profound. This was a table built not by obligation or blood, but by choice, love, and recognition. This was the family I had been searching for, the belonging I had been denied, and it existed because I had the courage to create it. The conversation drifted to stories of hardship and triumph. Mr. Owens recounted memories of children grown and scattered across the country, of winters endured in quiet solitude, of days when no one noticed him. Marissa shared her struggles, her daughter chiming in with laughter that made the room brighter. The teens told stories of resilience, of days when life had been unforgiving, and how small acts of kindness, like mine, had reminded them that someone cared. I listened, occasionally offering a word, sometimes laughing, sometimes nodding in understanding. And with each story, with each shared moment, I felt an invisible weight lifting, a lifetime of being overlooked, undervalued, and underappreciated, melting away in the warmth of chosen family. At one point, I stepped back to pour wine and looked around the room. Candles flickered against mismatched plates, voices intertwined in a gentle hum, hands passed dishes, eyes met in quiet acknowledgement. There was no polish, no social performance, no image to maintain. There was only authenticity, only care, only presence, only belonging. And I realized, with a sense of awe, that I had done something extraordinary, not in grand gestures or accolades, but in creating a space where love was unconditional, where everyone could be themselves without apology, where being present was enough. I thought of Camila, my sister, who would be at her table, polished and perfect, her boyfriend impressed by appearances, unaware of the depth and substance that existed beyond her curated life. I thought of Mom, of Dad, their eyes trained on achievement, image, and convenience. And I felt nothing, not resentment, not anger, not bitterness, only a quiet satisfaction, a steady calm. They had given me the most extraordinary gift without realizing it: exclusion. And in that exclusion, I had discovered freedom, choice, and the power to build something real. Dinner continued, plates were refilled, and laughter grew louder, more confident. I shared small victories of the week, stories from the garage, tales of engine repairs and mechanical triumphs that elicited nods of understanding and appreciation. The teens listened with wide eyes. Mr. Owens chuckled quietly, and Marissa smiled, her gratitude palpable. I realized then that recognition, when given freely and sincerely, carried far more weight than conditional praise ever could. After the meal, we cleared the table together, voices soft, laughter lingering. I watched the teens carry dishes to the sink, Marissa's daughter fold napkins clumsily but with joy, Mr. Owen stacking plates carefully, a small pride in his eyes. And I understood, fully, that belonging was not a gift given by birth, by blood, or by expectation. Belonging was created, nurtured, chosen. And for the first time in my life, I was part of it. Not as a shadow or a helper, not as a daughter or a sister, not as someone useful or strong, but as Harper Lane, steady, quiet, and entirely present. The evening wound down, and the room grew quiet, except for the hum of conversation and the crackling of the candles. I sat back, a mug of coffee in hand, watching my chosen family converse, laugh, and simply exist without pretense. And I realized that I had built something far greater than a meal or a table. I had built a sanctuary, a community, a space where people were valued not for what they did or how they appeared, but for who they were. And in building it, I had finally given myself the belonging I had spent decades seeking. For the first time, I understood fully that exclusion had not been punishment. It had been liberation. The absence of conditional approval had created space for choice, space for authenticity, space for warmth. And in that space, I had discovered the extraordinary truth that life, love, and family could be defined on my own terms. That Thanksgiving, as the sun set over Boulder, casting long shadows across the apartment, I felt a quiet joy swell within me, a joy that had nothing to do with perfection, appearances, or accolades, and everything to do with truth, love, and chosen belonging. I had spent decades repairing things, fixing what others broke or ignored. That day, I realized the most important thing I had ever built wasn't a car engine, a faucet, or a lawnmower. It was a table of warmth, love, recognition, and freedom. A table I had built with my own hands, my own heart, and my own choice. And for the first time in my life, I sat down at it, not as the overlooked daughter, not as the useful sister, not as the strong but invisible one, but as Harper Lane, seen, loved, and fully, completely free.